Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the AgView Pitch. Today, we are going to talk late spring planting. I had Troy Deutmeyer with me here, I don't know, about a month ago, and we talked about spring planting best practices in a drought situation in Iowa, Northeast Iowa is where we're recording this at. And now we went from drought to drowning. There's water standing in almost all the fields around in our area now. And I think there's a lot of people in a lot of states that have a lot to go yet. I think there's a lot in, but I also think there's a lot to go. And so I appreciate you coming back again, Troy, to kind of have a conversation around some best practices and late planting. Those fields that are planting are sitting in some pretty wet conditions, and there's a lot of things to think about. So I think what we'll do here today is we'll start working on talking through a bunch of different issues, and hopefully we'll hit them all.
Sure. And I guess if we
So
start talking about a lot of rain, it'll probably end up another month. We'll be talking about
it'll be dry
it'll
again,
be
right?
dry
Yeah,
again.
right. Yeah. Well, our tile went from nothing coming out of them to they're completely full
Full.
now again. So yeah, it's at least we know they work, and we're
Right.
finding the ones that don't work again now too. So
Yep. People are finding some suck holes.
yeah, and I think the other thing that people are seeing is you're finding the fields that are well tiled versus the fields that aren't tiled as well, as far as being able to get in the field to get after things or to look at those fields that are planted and see kind of the saturated areas versus the areas that have kind of drained some. So with that said, let's get rolling here. I want to start out with just understanding the the penalties that could be there in a late planning situation. There's really always the calendar versus the conditions, right? It's the two C's. It's like, okay, do we push this an extra day? Let's say that, and I know people are listening to this from, north to south and east to west. So we'll talk about this in generalities. We don't have to get super specific on dates, but you need to understand your region, your area, and need to understand at what point do we pull the trigger, and at what point how much are we giving up if we're out there mudding things in, I guess is the question.
Yeah. So a lot of times, Chris, there's I guess I'll just generalize with the corn belt. There's a lot of good data, coming out of even South Dakota, Minnesota, Iowa. You work way over into the other I states where we really don't lose a lot of yield until probably we start hitting that May 20th time frame. And
Mm-hmm.
that's generally about the same time we tell guys start thinking about switching up maturities and things like that. But
Mm-hmm.
until May 20th, which I guess gives us what, another 11 days or something like that from the
Yep.
time that we're recording this, we
Yep.
really don't lose much. So, we've got some time yet where I think that, we still prioritize the fitness, not mudding something in.
Mm-hmm.
And then as far as, how much can you lose when you mud it in? That's a pretty loaded question.
Yeah, it is.
Um, we've seen, as I'm sure many people know, that if it continues to rain, you can have a lot of sins forgiven out there. And if it continues to rain until, say, knee waist high corn, a lot of our brace root development, nodal root development has been made, and it's pushed through that sidewall compaction that we created with that planter. And in years like that, we see minimal yield loss to kind of push in conditions
Mm-hmm.
and getting in maybe a day earlier than what we normally would like to. The caveat to that is it turns dry, and all of a sudden you have serious sidewall compaction. It's pretty easy to lose 20, 30 bushels when you have
Mm-hmm.
that kind of type situation. So,
Mm-hmm.
you know, most people probably know Ken Ferry. I've followed him a lot over my career as well. And he says, you never mud in a corn crop.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that kind of shows the potential of how much you can lose when you do that. And so we'd have to get into, well into June planting dates before we could lose as much from a late planting
Mm-hmm.
as mudding in a crop, I guess is where I was going with that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I think also probably too, it would have some dependence on the soil type, knowing your soils, knowing the drainage, how quick's it going to dry out and stuff, that type of thing too. Or if you have 90-degree temperatures coming, because we've been sort of cool. I mean, not cool, but decent
Probably
temperatures and
average
wet.
temps. Yeah.
Right. But if all of a sudden
Turn
we
on
get
it's
some
dry
90-degree weather,
and bake it.
yeah, that asking for trouble. So anything on planter settings, in the first conversation we had, we talked a lot about, the high speed planters and all of the different settings and things. Anything different there from our first conversation or anything as we're planning later that we need to be thinking about in terms of, marginal conditions, seeding depth? Do you change anything
Sure.
there from what we talked about earlier?
So actually, one of the things that we talked about, and I actually 2 weeks ago sent out something on my social media post in regards to getting dry soil down into the seed slot. We wanted
Right.
to increase down pressure to keep that furrow in place, and actually, so now with the wet conditions, we're actually going to be looking at the exact opposite. We're going to
Right.
want to be able to make that planter dance as light as possible. And thankfully, with the technology that we have, a lot of planters now have the hydraulic downforce systems that can actually lift.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I caution growers on that I've seen in the past with wet conditions is those way pins are measuring the pushback that it's getting from the soil. Well, when you have wet soil, there's not much strength there, and so
Mm-hmm.
the soil doesn't have that strength to
Right.
push back to make that sensor read what it wants to read.
Right.
So it can actually put more down pressure on than what you want quite easily. So again, you're gonna have to get out of the tractor and dig. But that's probably one of the things that we've noticed work extremely well in the past is to almost get to uncomfortable margin levels and
Mm-hmm.
maybe not quite have that upper 90s, good ride, ground contact, and kind of lower those settings to make sure that we don't do too much sidewall compaction. As far as planting depth, we want to maintain that, 2 and a quarter on corn, inch and a half on the soybeans, just like we normally do. So we really don't want to change planting depth at all. On the soybeans, the one thing that we will start to see here, especially now that we're getting close to the middle of May, is we'd like to see higher seeding rates for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people don't have this option, but if you do have the option to go to narrow rows,
Mm-hmm.
we really notice that the yield advantage anymore for narrow rows comes after the 15th of May, kind of along the Highway 20, Interstate 80 corridor. So if you have that option, once we
Mm-hmm.
start getting another week or two out,
Yeah.
definitely increase the seeding rate. If you have the option to go to, 15s or narrowers that we can help capture sunlight that we've missed,
Mm-hmm.
so far during the growing season.
So on population with soybeans, you're going to want to gradually to kind of what degree? I mean, in the previous conversation we had, we talked about variable rate
Mhm.
seeding. We talked about 140, kind of maybe hitting that average, and anywhere from that 110 to 170 on the lighter soils. How does that change?
So I think we're going to probably want to go 10 to maybe 20% higher on our
Okay.
seeding rate as we, get out, past the middle of May, and especially as we get toward the 1st of June, we're definitely going to want to, get to that 15, 20% more. So then that way we're making up for nodes and pods,
Mm-hmm.
through plants
Yeah.
because of lost time.
Gotcha. Any other thing on the planning as far as, settings, anything there before we shift gears to the next thing there? Um, One thing I do want to talk about, I guess, in the planning, or another quick question as it relates to that, is seed preparation, right? Is that field cultivator or that VT or whatever? It seems like in our observation, we see that the strip till, you can almost get out there a day or so earlier than you can maybe than when you should have a field cultivator out there, or any kind of tillage to get that seed prep ready. Any depth settings there that you want to, I mean, kind of be careful of and watch there? I mean, obviously you don't want to be digging up a bunch of mud and bringing that up.
So that's probably one thing too. We talked about decreasing down pressure, and we probably want to shallow up the tillage. I'd
Mm-hmm.
still like to see you definitely get below, where your seed bottom of your seed slot's going to be.
Okay.
But we still have guys out there, whether they admit it or not, or run that field cultivator 4 or 5 inches deep, and we can
Too
probably
deep.
shallow that up to 3, 4 inches,
Mm-hmm.
and like just like you said, not be pulling up too much mud.
Right. One of the challenges I always see with like field cultivators, especially these big ones anymore, you got a 58-foot field cultivator and getting that thing level from front to back and side to side. I mean, that's the thing, you talk about digging the planter, digging all 12 rows or 24 rows or whatever. Same, kind of the same thing with the tillage tool, right? Just making sure that it's uniform.
Yeah, if you during these rain delays, get that thing unfolded on the nice little patch of concrete and
Yeah.
make sure that
Yeah.
from side to side, you're right.
Yeah.
There can be quite a bit of depth difference over a 40, 50 foot wide field cultivator.
Exactly. A lot of details that we could be paying attention to when it's raining here. seed treatment, I want to hit on that for a second. Um, we talked about it in our first conversation, and I know there's growers out there that either will go naked without any, and I'll pick on soybeans first, or they'll maybe just do a levo or just do something. What are they giving up if they just do one thing or another? Can you hit on those, kind of the whole kit and caboodle versus
Sure.
this piece or that piece?
I guess you brought up Alevo specifically, so I'll start with that one. Alevo is very specific to sudden death syndrome and also soybean cyst nematode. And, typically we think of sudden death infecting, within the first few days of when the seed's planted. And typically it's when we have wet
Mm-hmm.
and generally cooler soils. And, we're still, at least where we're at here in Iowa, upper 50s.
Mm-hmm.
And so that, can still get us some sudden death. So we're not out of the woods yet. And if the, weather forecast continues wet with these same temperatures, I would still probably highly consider that. Now, most of the other would most companies would consider standard seed treatments. They're going to cover the things like Phytophthora, Rhizoctonia,
Mm-hmm.
Pythium,
Yep.
and I I'm a strong believer in that, whether it's April 15th planting or June 10th. Mother Nature has done a great job of no matter what the temperatures are, and if you have even just adequate to wet soil conditions, there's a disease out there. Pythium's generally a little bit colder, Rhizoctonia is high,
Mm-hmm.
warmer temperatures, Phytophthora, warmer temperatures. And so just because we're getting into later into the calendar year, a lot of times people think that, well, I don't need to spend the money on seed treatments
Yeah.
because that's an early planting, cold soil kind of type thing. And, Phytophthora just loves warm, wet soils.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'd still highly encourage folks to stick with the seed treatments on the soybeans. And, most of the time, the just about every company has a standard corn seed treatment that's going to cover most of these things.
Mm-hmm.
And there's not really a whole lot extra we can add on except for maybe some insecticide for
Mm-hmm.
rootworm management. So the good news is there's been a lot of improvements in the seed treatment arena that really doesn't get talked about a lot because we spend all our time talking about insect traits or herbicide traits and
Mm-hmm.
just overall genetic yield. And the seed treatment really isn't all that sexy of a topic, so it doesn't get covered a lot. So, but there's been huge improvements over the last 5 or 6 years where, man, I tell you what, the seed treatments are just rock solid anymore.
Right. Um, so that's good to know, and that kind of backs that question up. You mentioned insecticides. Um, there's a fair amount of producers with some corn on corn in certain areas, and I know a lot of people listening to this probably either have planted their corn on corn or they have corn on corn to plant yet. What's your take on the insecticide? So let's say they're in an area where they're running a maybe a half rate or a full rate with a triple stack or whatever, but talk a little bit about that early planted stuff. Are we getting so much water that we're moving that insecticide out of the root zone, or as we plant later, do we need more or less? Talk a little bit about the insecticide management corn on corn now.
On the early planted, some of these areas that are 10 plus inches of water now, Chris, I think there's probably a pretty good chance that some of that is getting diluted down. Um, but the thing is there really isn't anything at this point
What are you going to do?
we can do anymore.
Yeah.
We used to have the option to Y drop some Loras band to go after some additional rootworm protection if a situation like this would occur. But as of right now, there isn't a whole lot that we can do. As far as the fields that have yet to get planted, if you were planning on using whatever rate for rootworm control, I would recommend that you would still stick with that. We've had no rootworm hatch yet. We're still a month away from that.
Mm-hmm.
So let's be sure the whatever insecticide you were planning on those acres and that rate, let's stick with it.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess just for the good of the cause, probably 6, 7 years ago, we completely recommended stop using half rates.
Mm-hmm.
You want half performance, use a half rate.
Yeah.
And there's just too much at stake.
Yeah. Yep. All right. It answers that question, I think. I guess the next thing I want to ask about is nitrogen loss. Um, there's a lot of fall applied this year because of the way last fall was, of anhydrous particularly, obviously, and then there's the spring applied 32. Some of that stuff's in the nitrate form, some of it's in ammonium form. Talk a little bit about the threats there, the potentials, and the issues that people need to be aware of.
Okay, I'll start with the easy one, and that's anhydrous. And I think whether it was fall applied or spring applied, because our soil temperatures haven't been, above 50 degrees for weeks on end, I think, well, I feel very confident that most of that is still in the ammonium form and is just fine. It's going to be
Mm-hmm.
there available for our crop as we move on. Um, people always ask, well, I used N-Serve. How much does that help me? Generally that's going to give you about an extra 2 weeks of protection. And so, for those maybe a little bit further south, I-80 or even south of there, that's probably going to start benefiting us here over the next week or two if we continue to stay wet. But overall, I feel very good about the anhydrous fields, whether it was fall or spring applied. The UAN, so generally, like you said, 25% of that is nitrate the day it's applied. And, if you've, again, one of those areas you've had 10, 12 plus inches of rain, some of that has probably moved down through the profile. Uh, the good news is, in my opinion, I think that most areas were so dry to start with that I don't think it's gone. I think it's just lower in the rooting profile. And the concern now will be is if we continue to drive around and see water standing in the fields.
Mm-hmm.
There's kind of a misconception out there that we lose most of our nitrogen through leaching. It goes down and exits through the tile lines and things like that, maybe because that's just what gets the press. But actually, we lose the majority of our nitrogen in a wet year when we have saturated conditions, and that nitrate turns into a gas and it bubbles off and it goes back up into the atmosphere. So where I'm going with that is if in your area, maybe you're wet, but you're not saturated, you probably haven't lost a lot of nitrogen yet.
Mm-hmm.
Just from the fact that, again, you have to have almost standing water for the denitrification process. And then most people were pretty darn dry. Like you mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
when we did this a month ago, the tile lines weren't even running.
Right.
So I think a lot of that nitrate that maybe got, or nitrogen that got converted over to nitrate, is still in our rooting profile.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So at this point, I'm not too concerned. You give another 2, 3 weeks of this, and then any urea or UAN applications, then we can probably start thinking 30, 40% losses possibly.
Mm-hmm. So stay tuned on your nitrogen loss, so
Correct.
to speak.
Yeah, I wouldn't be losing any sleep over it yet, but another couple of weeks
Yeah.
and then we'll probably have to
Right.
go to plan B.
Gotcha. So, you talked about the standing water areas or the saturated soils and stuff, and we talked about seed treatment, but I want to circle back a little bit for a second here with respect to future disease pressure because of the conditions and the environment that we have now. Are there anything that we should be thinking about as we move forward, as we watch the crops begin to grow and things that we should be watching for, either for corn, soybeans, or anything there in
Yeah, so
particular?
there's a lot of times those, unfortunately, again, we can't really manage for them other than the
Right.
seed treatments that we've already talked about. But then as we move into the growing season, especially as we get into the grain field period, is when we're going to want to kind of keep an eye on things like crown rots.
Mm-hmm.
And those typically infect very early
Yep.
on, and it just takes a long time for them to pull down a corn plant. So then, probably again, you start talking the August time frame would be the time to go out, split some stalks, dig them up, see what the crown looks like, and if it's compromised, then that's probably something that we need to move up on the harvest schedule.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if we do continue to stay moist, and especially if the temperature, picks up, then we start talking later on in the growing season about things like, gray leaf spot and tar spot.
Mm-hmm.
But we're a month or two away from having to
Mm-hmm.
probably start to really get overly concerned about that. Um, Hopefully, again, if the seed treatments do their job here and pull us through the next 3 to 4 weeks, and things turn back to a little bit more normal,
Hmm.
we should be okay. But yeah, the crown rots are generally the ones that we can kind of start to, get concerns about, at least in the corn. And then things like rhizoctonia, phytophthora, and would probably be some of the two main soybean diseases that we'd be, concerned about moving forward.
Okay. Yeah, and it seems like the, back to the nitrogen deficiency for a second, it seems like there's almost, and tell me if I'm wrong, but it feels like, or anyway, on years like this where we've had some nitrogen loss, those plants are more susceptible to the leaf diseases and stuff too. Is that something that you see? And another reason why we need to really pay attention to that as the growing season goes on to make sure we need to do some additional side dressing or whatever it's probably warranted, or thoughts there.
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. So whenever you have a plant, or even us as humans, when we're malnourished,
Hmm.
everything else just accelerates.
Yeah.
And you're exactly right. Some people that have some very, very good fertility levels, it just seems like they just don't get the foliar diseases later on in the growing season, that,
Hmm.
maybe some of the rented ground that's got lower uh, soil test levels, see. And so I agree 100% that the nitrogen component, it can definitely impact the late season diseases, and how well that crop can hold together until we can
Hmm.
get it through the combine.
Okay. We're getting down to the last couple of things. The next area, though, I want to hit on with you is crop protection. Um, Before we started recording, you're like, I've seen some weed pressure around it. I think we're going to see quite a bit more of that because, you talked about, up to that May 20th. We're 10 days away as we're recording this, of hoping to get done planting, but there's also getting things dried out and all that stuff and be able to get sprayers running. And there's a ton, even in fields that are going to be tilled. The tillage equipment's maybe not going to catch everything. It's probably going to get 80% of those giant ragweed or whatever is out there, right? Those big weeds. And then the other thing too is these pre-emerge herbicides and the cover crop, and there's other complexities sometimes where all of a sudden the timing that was in the plan is out the window, right? So talk first about, the pre-emerge, and then we'll hit some of the post-app stuff. But anything comments there?
Just on the pre-emerge, the big focus is always on the soybeans, because a lot of those group 14 herbicides, like your Sonic Authority or your, Valor Fierce kind of type products, need to be on before the soybeans are cracking through. And as we move forward, the temperatures are going to increase, which means,
Germination's quick.
yeah. So, I just noticed pulling in here that your guys's soybean plot that we planted, geez, was that probably about 18 days ago?
Yep.
For
Probably
some,
about, yeah.
we just starting to, I could just start to row it there
Yep.
when I was pulling in. And, now we're looking at soil temperatures in the 60s. So, you're going to have beans up in about 10 days.
Hmm.
And so we really need to make sure that we can get those herbicides on before, especially in soybeans, before those things crack through. And if that's pushing it, I know there's some beans got planted, some stuff got planted here. And by the time guys are able to get back into the field to start spraying again, let's make sure that we get out there and take a look to make sure that we don't have beans emerging if we're using those kind of type of herbicides, because it was tough getting the crop in once, much
Yeah.
less having to turn around and do it again. So that's probably the biggest thing on the soybeans. And most of our corn herbicides and corn packages that are out there right now, the majority of them we can put on pre-emerge or early post.
Hmm.
And so there's a lot more flexibility there as far as a crop safety standpoint and a timing standpoint. Um, the other thing to keep in mind is, a lot of times, if you do have some weeds emerged, that a lot of these pre-herbicides aren't great burn downs, so
Yeah.
guys aren't using, throwing a glyphosate or something like that
Yep.
in. And so that would be the other thing, is to get out there and scout before
See
that
what's in.
sprayer
Yeah.
runs across, and make sure that, if there are weeds that are emerged, what we
Right.
have in the tank is gonna take care of them and bring them down.
Hmm.
On the posts side, and again, driving around the countryside, there's going to be fields that will be at that V2, V3 corn stage here, probably by this time next week,
Hmm.
some of the early planted stuff. And so then that means that it's time for those guys to start getting their post herbicide application as well. And that's the one thing, I guess, that we've really been pushing in both corn and soybeans here over the past 5 or 6 years is to do that post herbicide application when the crop is small. And I
Hmm.
think we talked about it on the pitch here, but I can't remember it. The ideology behind that is, the crop is small, the weeds are small, so
Hmm.
the weeds are easier to kill. The crop doesn't have a bunch of leaf area to soak in a bunch of herbicide that it has to detoxify. And we have a bunch of residual herbicides in these post herbicide applications. Now we need them to get to the soil to work. And so if you have a big crop with big weeds, that
Hmm.
residual component does not get to the soil surface and doesn't can't do its job.
Right.
And so the
Mm.
earlier that you can spray, it seems counterintuitive. Guys a lot in the past have wanted to say, well, I'm going to wait just a little bit longer so I can spray and then get to canopy right away. And our data has actually shown, and the university data has shown as well, that, you know, V2, V3
Get out there.
corn,
Yeah.
V2, V3 soybeans, get out there and get that done, because then you can get your value out of your soil residual
Hmm.
herbicide.
Yeah. One of the conversations we've had in our operation here has been those fields that didn't get planted that are going to be tilled, that were going to be two pass, might switch to single pass now. Any comments on that? Is that an okay way to think, or is that, because your tillage theoretically is going to, start you out clean again, and then, you know, that corn's going to be back up, like you said, in 7 or 8 days if it's really warm, and then you get to that early stage and go out and do that one pass. Any thoughts on that, or is that?
So it's a possibility that that could um, be a viable option, I guess, Chris. But we would probably recommend to still try to keep that two pass system if you can get the sprayer in there, get the pre-emerge done, and then go ahead and um, get the post on. Probably that end up being 3 to 4 weeks later.
Mm-hmm.
We've just the with the water hemp battles, and even some things like velvet leaf and lamb's quarter seem to be getting more challenging to
Mm-hmm.
control. It just seems like the two pass systems, if you can
You can
possibly
get it
do
done.
it, would still
Mm-hmm.
be the best way to go.
Well, it makes sense too, because if your corn's going to germinate in five, or emerge in
So are the
5 days, the
weeds.
weeds are too.
Yeah, they're right
So
behind it.
yeah, yeah, and it doesn't take many weeds to get a yield penalty pretty fast too.
Yeah, so there's some real good data out there. I think I posted this on social media a while back as well. We need to have weeds controlled by the time they're 2 inches tall, or we start losing yield.
Yeah.
And especially by the time they're 3, 4 inches, you've basically paid for a herbicide program if you let them get that big
Right.
in yield loss.
Yeah. Yeah. You just didn't write a check.
You just didn't write the
Yeah.
check. So sometimes you think you didn't pay for it, but
Yeah. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
you ended up paying
It's
for it.
weird how that stuff happens a lot. So, my last question, and this is kind of a category in and of itself, but there's a lot of stuff planted as well. There's a lot of stuff that's been in some situations. I mean, we had a soybean field that caught a little hail a couple days ago. There's just, things that can happen on those early planted fields that require replant. And so I want to just hit that for a minute. Um, Talk a little bit about populations, what you're looking for. Obviously, uniformity is important and all that kind of stuff. But what are some of the key things that if a person has to think through that replant and stuff, other than calling your Pioneer rep and saying, "Hey, come out and look at this with me," the environment wasn't cooperating.
Yeah. Well, you hit the first one there is call your local seed rep, because a lot of times there's emotion
Yeah.
when you're looking at your own field. And it's
Mm-hmm.
not like your seed rep doesn't have concerns and doesn't care about your crop either, but they're one step away from it, and you can kind of maybe stay a little bit more level headed when you have another person out there. So essentially, what we're looking at in soybeans anymore, if you have 80 or 90,000 left, the magic number used to be 100,000. And with how the soybeans bush and branch out,
Mm-hmm.
we just don't really see that we need that many anymore. So if I'm out in the field, actually, before I came here, we were out looking at some soybeans that were emerged that caught some hail here the other night in
Mm-hmm.
just a freak little small area. And 80,000 is what we're going to keep from here on out,
Mm-hmm.
moving down the calendar. So that's kind of the number on the soybeans. And as we move later into the season, the corn number kind of changes a little, but if I'm north of 25,000, on my corn stand right now. I'm definitely keeping it. And as we work toward maybe that 1st of June, we probably keeping a 22 or even a 20, 23 or even a 22,000, something like that. So hopefully most people
Hmm.
won't get that low. But yeah, you're right. There's freak situations that happen, and
Hmm.
we need to do some stand evaluations. But that's kind of the numbers that we like to shoot for.
If stuff's underwater, you got what, couple of days or whatever, and that all of a sudden, but then you also have some disease issues and other things when it's submerged too.
Yeah. So generally, when you start looking at 60-degree soil temps, you got probably at most 3 days.
Hmm.
And then things just, I know I couldn't hold my breath for 3 days. So actually, 3 days is actually pretty impressive that the crops can do that. And those are usually fairly easy ones to look at though, because
Hmm.
by the time the water recedes, the
Yeah.
the plants are dead, and then it takes another 4 or 5 days before it's fit to
Yep.
get back in there to replant anyway. But
Yeah.
yeah, generally, so if you see some water sitting around for a couple days, most of the time those plants can handle a
Hmm.
couple days underwater.
Yeah. Um, I think we've covered everything, but I just thought of something that we talked about earlier. I want to circle back to real quick, and maybe we hit it, but I want to hit it again just to make sure we didn't miss it. Is the maturities um, by area, you know, from some of the data I've looked at, and I'm going to work on putting a spreadsheet together to calculate this because if you figure 4 cents a point on drying and you look at the ROI, and I haven't done this yet, but I will be doing this over the weekend. I want to look at, okay, if we're planting, say, in a given area, 113-day hybrid, and we're going to, maybe think about going to 108-day instead, but you're giving up 5 bushel of yield potentially, but it's wetter, you're
Mhm.
still better off taking the yield. I think I need to do the math, but do you have any comments on that
Yeah, and I'll
specifically?
actually just flip my iPad around here and kind of show you, and I can send that to you, Chris, if you
We
want
can put
to.
a link to this in
Yeah,
the podcast
yeah.
too.
And so basically, what it's showing is they're looking at data from South Dakota, Minnesota, Iowa, and you're exactly right that I mentioned that May 20th kind of time frame. That's where we kind of start to see the yield advantage go away enough that it's not going to pay for the additional drying.
Okay.
So, but yeah, I'll send you this link. But you're exactly right. The That May 20th just seems to be a really solid date throughout the Corn Belt where we need to stick with Plan A,
Hmm.
because Plan A generally had the hybrid that you and your seed rep chose for that field for a reason.
Hmm. Yeah.
And that's so important to start with. And if the longer we can hold on to that plan, the better. So yeah.
So I want to ask that on soybeans real quick too. Then, so like soybeans, I've always heard in the past. So I'm gonna get this correct from the horse's mouth here. If you're better off staying with the fuller season soybeans later,
Mhm.
I mean, we always have had good luck planting early beans early, but it seems like as you get later, you're better off with those fuller season beans. Is that right? Is that
Yeah.
true? And why is that?
No, you're exactly right. The kind of, I said in corn, May 20th is kind of the magical date, and it seems like about June 10th
Okay.
is it in soybeans. So no matter where you're at and whatever full season is for you, June 10th, once we start getting to that point, and hopefully we won't, but
Mm-hmm.
that's where we would think about starting to early up the soybean maturities.
Mm-hmm.
So we got
Okay.
almost a month.
Okay. Yep. Awesome.
Stick with the plan for
Yep.
another month.
Yep. That's right. Okay, well, I had a list there for you. I sent you this morning. I texted you. So is there
Yeah, it
any?
was a long text.
Yeah, well, yeah, my wife wasted me a bad time. Don't send a text that's that long, but there's a lot of stuff here, right?
Yeah.
So anything else I didn't hit on or anything you want to leave growers with, any of that final word?
No, I think, stick with the plan is probably the main one, moving forward yet. And then, really make that planner just tiptoe.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
and thank goodness, we're in a time now where we can do that with our planners
Yep.
from the cab,
Right.
but still get out and check, have that guide tender and seed, making sure that we're not doing too much sidewall compaction. Probably the biggest thing that I've seen here over the last 2 or 3 times where we could get in for a day or two is not getting the seed slot closed all the way to the bottom.
Hmm.
So just be checking that. So
So
those are
making sure the closing wheels are
doing their job.
adjusted properly.
Yeah.
Yeah, good
Yeah.
point.
And when it is wet, the closing wheels will do their job if the gauge wheels weren't doing too much of their
Yeah,
job, I guess,
exactly.
if you want to put it that way.
Yep.
So those are the two main things. But yeah, stick with the plan and just keep checking those planner settings.
Awesome. Well, Troy, really appreciate it again.
You
Thanks
bet.
for swinging in and doing this. I think there's a lot of people across the country who appreciate your information. It was definitely the first one we did with you was super popular and I got a lot of comments, and so
Thank
sincerely
you.
appreciate it. So
All right, everybody stay safe out there.
will do. And like to thank everybody again too. If you've got other topics, other things you need us to be hitting on, let us know. And with that said, we'll catch you again next time on the Ag View Pitch.